opens lines for queen and bishop, asserting central control immediately. Developing the knight towards the center, aiming to contest key squares and prepare for pawn breaks. Controlling the center and building a pawn phalanx, white immediately stakes a claim for the crucial d5 square. Solidifying the center and preparing for an eventual pawn push to d5, black opts for a flexible setup. Securing the center and preparing development, this natural square for the knight enhances piece coordination. Centralizing pawns immediately contests the core of the board, initiating a rich positional battle for d5's influence. Striking the pawn opens a central dialogue, potentially simplifying into an endgame where piece activity becomes paramount. Reclaiming the pawn on d5 with the knight repositions it centrally, immediately challenging white's central control and preparing for active piece play. Developing the knight solidifies central control and prepares for castling, aiming for a harmonious setup. Initiating central pawn tension, black boldly challenges white's d4 foothold, aiming for dynamic counterplay. Instead of directly challenging the central pawn structure, this allows black to solidify their pieces and potentially gain more attacking opportunities, as the nc3 now lacks immediate support and the d4 pawn becomes a potential target. Securing the central pawn chain and developing another piece, black aims to solidify their presence in the middle of the board, preparing to challenge white's queenside space. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal prepares for kingside castling, while also supporting potential pawn pushes in the center and eyeing black's somewhat exposed queenside pawn structure. A logical development, this bishop gracefully exits the pawn chain, preparing to castle and connect the rooks while supporting the central tension and looking towards the kingside. Solidifying the kingside with castling is a fundamental step, preparing to connect the rooks and activate them along the open files that are likely to emerge. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount as castling into the center's embrace clears the pathway for developing the remaining pieces. Securing the queenside pawn structure is paramount here, preventing any immediate queenside expansion by black and subtly reinforcing control over the b4 square. Unlocking the central pawn structure with this capture immediately alters the game's dynamic, opening lines for pieces and forcing a reassessment of piece development, potentially leading to a more open middle game where piece activity becomes paramount. Reclaiming the central pawn opens a pathway for your pieces, particularly the queen, to participate actively, while simultaneously challenging black's knight's central dominion. The knight gracefully retreats, its prior central occupation now ceded, allowing white's pawn structure to solidify a touch more. This repositioning prepares for a potential pawn push in the center, or perhaps aims to eye the queenside. It's a move of subtle reassessment, yielding a minor concession for future maneuverability. Asserting control over the d4 pawn and preparing for eventual central pawn breaks, this bishop relocation to a more active diagonal opens up possibilities for a kingside attack and adds pressure along the c-file, while also ensuring the pawn on d4 remains well defended. Opening up the queenside to develop the light-squared bishop and prepare for potential queenside expansion seems to be the primary objective here, aiming to free the position and potentially contest the center or launch an attack on the queenside later. A bold redirection of the queen to a central square, aiming to support the advance of the e-pawn and prepare for potential central breakthroughs, while simultaneously eyeing the h7 pawn as a future target. The bishop finds a comfortable diagonal, eyeing the queenside and reinforcing the central pawn structure. It's a logical placement, aiming for long-term influence without immediate fireworks. Unpinning the knight from its influence on the d-file is a primary objective, aiming to gain flexibility and potentially open lines for the queen later. Preparing a kingside fianchetto to challenge white's central control is a sound positional decision, aiming to develop a long-range attacker for the dark squares and secure the monarch. Reinforcing the e-file with the rook sets the stage for potential central pressure, eyeing the dark squares around black's castled king, a quiet but purposeful move aiming to improve piece coordination and prepare for future operations. Bringing the rook to the e-file signals an intent to contest central open lines and potentially prepare for pawn pushes on the king side. But it also leaves the d6 pawn somewhat exposed if white decides to switch focus. Initiating a pawn storm on the king side, this aggressive thrust aims to dismantle black's defensive structure and open lines towards the enemy monarch, potentially creating threats of an early mating attack or forcing concessions. Focusing on controlling the open c-file, black reroutes the rook, preparing to contest this crucial corridor and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure. This maneuver establishes control over the semi-open c-file, a crucial highway for future operations, directly challenging black's pawn structure and potentially disrupting their queenside coordination while preparing a robust queenside presence. The knight surges to d5, a bold outpost demanding attention and potentially disrupting white's harmonious setup, aiming to seize central influence and challenge the bishop on c2's dominance. A bold injection of cavalry aims to disrupt black's solid central structure, potentially targeting weaknesses on the king side or creating tactical imbalances by challenging the f6 knight. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side aims to disrupt white's centralized knights and potentially expose the monarch. A bold, if somewhat risky, attempt to seize the initiative by challenging the knight on e4. A bold maneuver, this knight hops back, redeploying to a central square where it eyes the vulnerable d5 pawn and reinforces potential breakthroughs along the c-file, creating a more cohesive defensive structure against black's aggressive pawn thrust. The exchange of bishops immediately alters the pawn structure, potentially opening the g-file for white's rooks and creating a slightly more open position, which might favor white's more developed pieces. Black's knight on f6 now lacks a crucial defender, and the dark squares around the king become a little less secure with the removal of the bishop. This decision invites a deeper look into black's piece coordination and defensive setup. Are they prepared for the potential onslaught? The knight's daring repositioning to g5 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating an immediate threat against black's weakened king side and opening lines that were previously solidified by the fianchettoed bishop. The knight leaps into a pivotal central outpost, immediately threatening white's king's protection on f3 and eyeing further disruption across the board. This energetic maneuver disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn chain and challenges the bishop on c2, forcing a quick recalculation of defensive priorities and potentially opening lines for black's queenside pieces. It's a bold gambit for central influence. Challenging the central control of black's knight, white repositions the queen to eye the e6 pawn and potentially create attacking chances on the king side, forcing black to reconsider their knight's aggressive advance. Seizing the hanging pawn on d4 offers a tactical reprieve, but at the significant cost of surrendering central influence and potentially leaving your own king exposed to white's increasingly active pieces. This audacious knight jump initiates a dynamic skirmish, aiming to exploit the pawn structure weakness on the queen side and create immediate tactical possibilities by threatening the critical c7 square. A critical decision point is reached as black captures the queen, initiating a dramatic shift in the material balance and potentially steering the game towards an endgame where the sacrificed pawn structure might become a liability if not handled with precision. The capture on e3 fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating doubled pawns for white, but opening the f-file for potential counterplay. This exchange simplifies the position, bringing us closer to an endgame where the slightly compromised kingside pawn structure might become a target for black's active pieces. White gains a slight material advantage, but the immediate challenge will be to coordinate those awkwardly placed doubled pawns and prevent black from exploiting the open lines. A daring lunge towards white's kingside, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the g2 pawn and potentially disrupt white's central structure. Exposing the king to an open diagonal, this recapture immediately ushers in an endgame where black's initiative on the queen side and active piece play, particularly the knight's penetration, will be heavily scrutinized. The knight's bold sortie to d4 immediately seizes control of a vital central square, threatening both the rook on e1 and the king, potentially forcing white into a defensive posture and opening avenues for further black piece activity. a bold gambit to exploit the exposed king, aiming to disrupt black's coordination. Strategic assessment asterisk. White's move b4 is a counterintuitive but potentially powerful attempt to regain initiative. Black's knight on d4 is a significant thorn, controlling crucial central squares and threatening further incursions. By bringing the bishop to e4, White aims to directly challenge this knight. Potential outcomes asterisk. If black exchanges knights, asterisk b4 would allow the exchange of the powerful nd4 for White's bc2. While this might simplify the position, it could also lead to a less favorable endgame for White, with black retaining an active bishop. If black retreats the knight, asterisk White could follow up with moves like h5, attempting to push black's pieces back and gain space on the kingside. This could also open lines for White's rook. Asterisk tactical considerations. Asterisk White might be calculating a series of exchanges that leave black's king vulnerable or create opportunities for White to infiltrate. Positional implications asterisk. This move sacrifices immediate material. A pawn exchange might be forced for dynamic potential. White is prioritizing activity and pressure over a solid pawn structure. The king's safety of both sides is a major factor, and White is hoping to exploit any weaknesses in black's camp. Overall asterisk. b4 represents a sharp, tactical decision. White is gambling on their ability to outplay black in a complex and potentially messy position, prioritizing initiative and king attack over material equality. It's a move that demands precise calculation and a willingness to embrace calculated risk. Trading off the bishop, the knight on g2 is now left vulnerable and isolated, potentially setting up a nasty discovered attack or a swift capture if black's pieces can coordinate effectively. A decisive moment hinges on exploiting the misplaced black knight, now that White's pieces have been coordinated to control key squares, creating a vacuum in the center for your queen to dominate. The knight's recapture aims to simplify the position, clearing a path for the rook on the now open b-file and forcing a stark material imbalance in black's favor with the queen gone, though it grants White an outpost on d5 for their knight. Unleashing a devastating discovered attack, this move aims to exploit the exposed enemy monarch and capture material, fundamentally altering the complexion of the game with a swift, aggressive thrust. The monarch scurries away from the discovered attack's shadow, seeking refuge on the f-file where the knight's dominance is less pronounced. Seizing the initiative, the knight's daring plunge into enemy territory now forces a decisive material exchange, promising to simplify the board and steer the game towards a clear advantage for White. A pivotal moment arrives as black recaptures the rook, aiming to stabilize a precarious position. This action immediately addresses White's potent knight outpost and attempts to simplify the material situation. However, the structural concessions made to achieve this exchange now present a distinct challenge, potentially leaving black's pawns on the kingside vulnerable and creating long-term weaknesses that will demand precise defensive maneuvering as the game transitions towards its endgame phase. The bishop pair advantage White has secured offers a significant positional edge. Securing the outermost edge of the board, this thrust aims to trap the enemy knight and restrict black's bishop's activity. Navigating the newly opened c-file demands immediate attention. The knight's repositioning aims to contest that crucial open pathway and prevent White's pawns from gaining further advanced outposts. Unleashing a decisive attack along the open file, White forces a dramatic confrontation for control of the center, aiming to expose black's slightly misplaced king and create weaknesses in its defensive structure. Securing the monarch with this retreat prioritizes safety, acknowledging the open file and the persistent knight threat, while preparing for the inevitable pawn exchange and a potential defensive formation. Seizing the open file immediately solidifies central control and prepares for an eventual pawn storm or a swift advance into black's territory, a decisive repositioning after the recent exchanges. A defensive sidestep, this pawn's advance momentarily shores up weaknesses on the kingside, but it offers little counterplay and might become a target itself as the rooks now eye each other from afar. Snatching that rook opens up a critical diagonal for your queen and immediately challenges black's entire queenside structure, creating immediate tension and forcing a reactive defense. e4 aims to reactivate the knight, bringing it back into the game after its forced sortie, and importantly, it puts immediate pressure on the a4 pawn, forcing white to defend it and potentially disrupting their intended plan of using the open files. This maneuver seeks to exploit white's pawn structure and create counterplay. The rook's aggressive thrust to the 6th rank immediately targets the weak, isolated pawn on d6, forcing black to confront its presence and potentially weakening their pawn structure further or surrendering material. The rook on d8 asserts itself, aiming to pry open that critical 7th rank and potentially disrupt the white king's nascent safety. The rook's redeployment to the 2nd rank signals a strategic pivot, aiming to contest the open, c, file and potentially activate the rook for a more dynamic role. A bold attempt to inject life into a passive position, black steers the rook towards the enemy king's sphere, aiming to create complications and potentially exploit the somewhat exposed white monarch, even if it means sacrificing some pawn structure on the queen side. A daring capture, this pawn grab attempts to capitalize on black's misplaced rook, but it opens up the b-file to white's king and potentially invites a dangerous counterattack if black can reroute their remaining pieces effectively. The rook now becomes a genuine thorn in white's side, actively eyeing weaknesses on the back rank and creating delightful possibilities for tactical maneuvering. Pushing the flank pawn gains vital space, aiming to restrict black's rook and create potential passed pawn opportunities later. Unleashing the pawn's aggressive potential, this ambitious advance disrupts white's rook's cozy position on the 7th rank and probes for weaknesses, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed royal family. Activating the rook to a more central posting, this maneuver intends to immediately contest the opened f file and challenge black's encroaching pawn majority. The knight's daring sortie into white's camp, aiming to disrupt their advancing pawns, opens a complex tactical knot. Black hopes to exchange material and simplify into a more manageable endgame, perhaps seeking to exploit the potential weakness of white's isolated king. This gambit, however, requires precise calculation, as white retains a dangerous initiative on the open files. The success of this maneuver hinges entirely on black's ability to navigate the ensuing exchanges without succumbing to white's piece activity. King secures its territory, preparing for a potential reshuffle as the material balance shifts dramatically. Opening the path for the rook to become a truly dominant force on the central files, this maneuver aims to exploit the currently exposed white king and create immediate pressure. Introducing a fresh attacking front on the queen side, now aims to exploit the open b-file and potentially create a passed pawn, forcing black to dedicate resources to its defense. The rook's relocation to the 3rd rank aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the queen side by supporting the advance of the pawn. This aggressive pawn thrust on the edge of the board seeks to create an unstoppable passed pawn, potentially deciding the game in your favor by limiting black's counterplay. Initiating a determined push down the queen side, black's rook embarks on a bold journey to exploit the advanced pawn, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure. The rook ventures out to the 6th rank, a bold assertion on the open file, aiming to dislodge black's pawns and probe for weaknesses in the enemy position. Unleashing a desperate attempt to stir chaos, the pawn advances, seeking to disrupt white's comfortable pawn chain and potentially create dangerous, albeit temporary, passed threats down the h-file. Sacrificing the pawn opens a pathway for the king to escape immediate pressure, though it does cede control of the critical kingside squares and invites further confrontation. The pawn's advance opens a clear diagonal for the white king to potentially escape the present confinement, while simultaneously creating an exposed passed pawn that will demand immediate attention from black's forces. The pawn chain aggressively advances, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's rook. This pawn push gambles on outflanking the white rook, aiming to open a diagonal for black's queen to join the attack on the kingside and disrupt white's pawn structure before the inevitable trade on the kingside. Pivoting the rook to the 8th rank effectively cuts off the black pawn advance and prepares to support a potential queenside push. The monarch scrambles, seeking a safe haven amidst the ensuing chaos, a desperate attempt to escape the tightening grip of white's pieces that now command key lines. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance aims to disrupt black's coordination and create a dangerous passed threat, forcing a decisive response. The opposing monarch, now completely exposed on the kingside, faces an immediate and potentially decisive threat as this pawn surges forward, demanding attention and forcing a difficult decision. The king's flight toward the action, a risky gambit for survival, seeks to escape the relentless pawn assault and perhaps even find a moment of counterplay amidst the chaos. The black rook galvanizes itself on the file, setting up a forceful check that forces the white king out into the open, exposing him to further harassment and potentially creating mating threats. This king's repositioning seeks to bring it into the endgame fray, offering a more active defense against the encroaching enemy pawn structure, and preparing to support potential pawn advances or counter black's threats on the king side. The pawn's desperate dash for promotion, a frantic gambit to disrupt white's advancing pawn wall, yet its proximity to the opposing king poses a tantalizing, if fleeting, threat. A desperate attempt to halt the invading pawn and force a perpetual check, though a better approach might have been to consolidate and defend the vulnerable king further. The black king, now exposed to the central squares, finds itself in a precarious position, with white's rook poised to exploit the open files and the exposed monarch. Sacrificing the rook forces a decisive king hunt, aiming to exploit the exposed monarch before black can consolidate. The king's desperate flight into the open ends with a forced sequence, as the rook's powerful pin on the knight makes further evasion impossible and leads to white's decisive king hunt. The pawn's march to promotion now becomes the paramount concern, a relentless march that black's king simply cannot intercept, signaling the beginning of the end. Promoting a queen is the logical next step to salvage the game, though the outcome remains highly uncertain given white's advanced pawn. Ascending to queen, the pawn creates an immediate, overwhelming material advantage, simplifying the game into a winning endgame where the extra queen dictates the play. This endgame presents a fascinating race where the black king, having bravely entered the fray, now faces the ultimate test of survival against a determined queen. King hunt enters its critical phase with the bishop checking the monarch. The king's perilous journey across the board is finally nearing its end, but not before another decisive queen sacrifice is forced, leaving white in a precarious position with their monarch exposed and their remaining pieces struggling to coordinate. The queen swoops in, targeting the exposed black king, forcing a critical decision that dictates the next phase of this intense endgame struggle. The monarch, now a pawn pusher, seeks refuge on a central square as the opponent's queen patrols a dark and dangerous diagonal. The white queen seeks to exploit the exposed black king, aiming to deliver a decisive blow by forcing it into a mating net or a highly unfavorable exchange. The monarch, after a perilous journey, seeks a safe haven. The queen's repositioning here forces a critical decision from black, aiming to exploit the open diagonals leading to the black king. Pushing the king into the open, a bold gambit to try and disrupt white's well-established battery on the queen file. Exploiting the queen's discovered attack, this forcing check aims to disrupt black's defensive formation and simplify into a winning endgame scenario. Navigating the ensuing chaos, black opts for a repositioning of the king, seeking a safer haven amidst the advancing pawns and the perpetual threats from white's queen. Unleashing a devastating discovered check forces black's king into further peril, simplifying into a winning endgame where the promotion threat is insurmountable. Pushing the king forward now opens a vital diagonal for the queen to deliver perpetual checks and potentially force a draw. The white queen, now a dominant force after the pawn promotion, initiates a powerful forcing sequence that will soon decimate black's remaining forces and secure victory. Unleashing the queen here seems like a desperate attempt to create immediate chaos, but it overlooks the fact that the opposing monarch is remarkably safe behind a fortress of pawns and well-placed pieces, while yours is now exposed to a dizzying series of checks that will likely lead to its demise.